if you're the Lions, you got to make that phone call, right? You got to call and at least ask about Maxx Crosby. It seems like it'd be stupid not to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Lions should make the phone call. They probably already have made the phone call. And I think that's something you realize when you're around teams is my favorite reports are always hey, so-and-so's checking in on the trade offer. Well, yeah, every team should be checking in on every trade offer, at the very least for their notes, even if they're not going to be able to get it. Because let's say you don't need a pass rusher now, but you need one in 2 years, and you're trying to track how initially the Raiders wanted a second for Davante and said, we have to get a second. But then it turned out they were able to get a third with only a second if he gets this All-Pro or AFC Championship ability. Well, that's something you need to understand when you're making decisions in 2 years from now on how you're going to trade. And so I think that for sure teams should be checking in on Maxx Crosby. I agree with you that it doesn't seem like he's going to be traded, but I think our colleague Charles Robinson made a great point this week when he said, hey, last year when they were trying to figure out what direction the Raiders should go, particularly at head coach and general manager, Mark Davis went to 3 players to try and weigh in: Maxx Crosby, Davante Adams, and Josh Jacobs. Davante Adams is now with the Jets, and Josh Jacobs is now with the Packers. And so I think that we have seen other really key anchors of that franchise be traded. I don't expect that to be the case with Maxx Crosby, but I think that we shouldn't be sure it's not going to happen given the franchise's track record on this. I think when you talk about the Lions, yeah, they should absolutely trade for a pass rusher, because here's the deal. You said you questioned the Jets trading for Davante Adams because they're trading for a guy after they lost a game when they are a little bit out of reach of what they actually want to do in the playoffs. The Lions are well within reach, and they have shown that repeatedly week to week this year. I mean, it's interesting seeing how physical they were against the Cowboys and how different the levels of physicality were from those two teams, because when I went to the Lions training camp this year, I went to 2 practices and I was like, oh my gosh, those practices were insane. And I know that sounds dramatic, but I visited 17 teams this summer, 14 during training camp alone. And the Lions practice was unlike any other team I visited. The level of physicality, yes, they were doing a mock game, but I've been at so many teams where I'm like, even if the pads are on, there's just not much physicality. And I understand the argument for that too. But Dan Campbell ran that practice like the former player that he is. And I think that we see that. In terms of getting a pass rusher, if I'm them, I'm calling the Jets and saying, clearly Hassan Reddick is not coming to your building, because if he was going to, he would have done that a long time ago. So how can we make something work? And also, you just gave up some draft capital to get Davante Adams. So don't you want some draft capital back? And I mean, that's the trade that I'm making if I'm the Lions.
Yeah, Hassan Reddick makes the most sense, because you could just call and be like, all right, you're giving up a third. We'll give you our third. There we go.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't feel like if you're a Jets fan, you're frustrated that he never saw the field, but he's not going to see the field anyway. So the Hassan Reddick move makes a lot of sense. I also, again, if you're Maxx Crosby, I will say this. Maxx is the face of the Raiders, and he's the best player this team has seen in a generation. I don't think Mark Davis can take the only guy that's a face and just remove him from the team, especially not knowing if they're going to be able to draft a quarterback. So I don't think he goes anywhere. But if we're going to apply the argument that the team sucks, they're not accomplishing their goals, maybe it's time to move on and let a great player go somewhere else and win. Couldn't we apply that same argument to everything about Myles Garrett? Like, the Browns are not going anywhere right now. The Browns quarterback play makes them an abject disaster. They just traded Amari Cooper, so they're telling you that they're in a little bit of a sell-off mode. Why not? If you're Myles Garrett, everything we could say about Maxx Crosby and why he deserves to play somewhere else also applies to Myles Garrett. Why not go out and move for Myles?
Yeah, and I actually think there's a stronger case against trading for Maxx Crosby, and here's what it is. When you look at the Carolina Panthers benching Bryce Young, and we were all questioning the decision at the time, but now I think we understand it a little more. I talked to people within that organization who said, look, yes, you don't want to ruin the quarterback going forward. Yes, you don't want to wreck his confidence, but when you're a first-year head coach, you need to get some wins because your culture as the head coach is depending on it. Your buy-in from the rest of the locker room is depending on it. This locker room doesn't care where the team is in 3 years. They care what they can do now and that they can win. And I think similarly, we saw that with Gerard Mayo and the Patriots switching to Drake May. And I was critical of that decision because I felt like the offensive line was not capable of supporting him. But there was this idea of that, yes, Gerard has been around the Patriots a lot longer than Dave Canales has been around the Panthers, but still, as a first-year head coach, you have to get that buy-in. Kevin Stefanski is the reigning head coach of the year. I'm not saying he's going to get it this year. I think we can all agree he's pretty much not going to get it this year, but I voted for him last year, and he deserved that because of how he won in spite of his quarterback rather than because of his quarterback and the game plans he was able to put together and everything like that. And so I think that he actually has a little more clout in that organization than we see Antonio Pierce already having with the Raiders from a head coaching standpoint, particularly. Not that he's not a respectable guy and a respectable coach, but he has not yet established his culture, and you need to establish that culture by getting some wins, and Maxx Crosby is really the heart and soul of that. I don't think the Browns are going to trade Myles Garrett, though, because they still have so much talent, and they were still in the playoffs last year. This is not a team that for like 5 to 10 years has not been competitive. This is a team that really you figure out the quarterback situation, and I would still think really highly of them. I mean, I can't remember if it was you or Frank or whatever, but there are so many people who thought the Browns were true Super Bowl contenders this year if Deshaun Watson could do even just average level quarterback play. And so I think that when you see that the problem with the Browns right now seems so obvious and so clearly one player in one position, albeit the most important position relative to winning a game, I think that's why you don't trade away Myles Garrett.